The restaurant was empty, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the gold watch on Richard's wrist. He tapped the glass face with a fingernail, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the stillness. He did not look at the door. He did not look at the windows. He kept his gaze fixed on the center of the table, where a crystal glass of wine sat perfectly centered on a white cloth. Every waiter in the room had retreated to the shadows near the kitchen, keeping their distance, watching him with eyes that refused to meet his own. Richard took a slow breath, the air around him feeling thin and brittle. He checked the watch again, then tilted his head, listening to the silence he had cultivated. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that demanded attention. He leaned back, the chair legs dragging across the polished wood with a grating, deliberate scrape. He shifted his weight, felt the texture of the chair against his palms, and waited for the staff to realize he was ready. He was the center of the room, and he knew it. He raised a hand, fingers snapping once against the air, and signaled for the waiter to approach. Daniel stepped forward, the heavy pitcher held firmly in his grip. He stopped 3 feet from the table, his posture stiff, waiting for the command. Richard did not look up. He stared at the wine glass, then gestured abruptly at a microscopic smudge on the white tablecloth. The movement was sharp, aggressive. Richard surged to his feet, the chair legs slamming against the floorboards with a violent thud. He pointed a finger, steady and hard, directly at Daniel's chest. "Are you blind? Look at this," Richard barked, his voice cutting through the silence like a jagged blade. Daniel flinched, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the pitcher. Richard stepped closer, invading the space until he could see the pulse jumping in the young man's neck. "You are useless," Richard spat, the words landing with deliberate weight. "A child could do this job better. You belong on the street, not serving professionals." Every eye in the kitchen turned toward them, but no one moved. The air in the room grew stagnant. Daniel bowed his head, his chin touching his chest, the muscles in his jaw locked tight. He did not look up. He did not defend himself. He simply stood there, absorbing the verbal strike as the silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. Daniel turned, his movements mechanical, his head still bowed. He walked toward the kitchen doors, his footsteps barely audible against the carpet. He reached the threshold, paused for a fraction of a second, and then disappeared into the dim light of the back corridor. Richard did not watch him leave. He watched his clients. He exhaled, his shoulders dropping from their rigid posture, and he let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. It was a sound devoid of humor, a signal that the interruption was over. He turned back to the table, his movements fluid and relaxed. He lifted the wine glass, the stem cool against his fingers, and took a measured, lingering sip. He looked at his clients, his gaze steady, his expression smooth and unbothered. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and began to speak again, his voice low and confident. He felt the weight of the room behind him, the silence of the other patrons, the stillness of the staff. He drew a deep breath, the taste of the wine sharp on his tongue, and he smiled. In that moment, he was the only thing that mattered. He was untouchable, and he knew it. 6 months crawled by, measured not in days but in the steady evaporation of noise. At first, the office remained busy, the air filled with the rapid clatter of keyboards and the constant hum of incoming calls. Then, the rhythm shifted. The phone lines went dead. The meetings stopped being scheduled. Richard sat behind his mahogany desk, watching the dust motes drift through the shafts of afternoon light, waiting for a ring that never came. He checked his accounts on the screen, refreshing the page until the numbers stopped changing. Then they began to drop. One by one, the totals bled toward zero. He watched the final balance vanish into red ink, a flicker of light on a monitor that signaled the end of his empire. The heavy silence he had once enforced on others now reclaimed his own workspace. It felt physical, a pressure against his eardrums that grew with every passing hour. He looked at the walls, stripped of plaques and awards, then at the empty corridors beyond his door. There were no more voices to command, no more clients to impress. The infrastructure of his life had simply ceased to function. He stood, pushed the chair back, and left the room to the settling dust. The transition was silent. He packed his final suitcase, the latches clicking shut like a period at the end of a long, failed sentence. He moved into a studio apartment where the walls held the smell of damp plaster and the radiator hissed a constant, rhythmic warning. His nights became defined by the metallic pop of a pull tab on a soup can. He sat on the edge of a narrow bed, spooning lukewarm broth into his mouth, watching the streetlights flicker against the frosted glass of his window. The city outside was vast, indifferent, and loud. Every morning, he pulled on the same suit, the one he had worn to boardrooms, now fraying at the cuffs and smelling of stale air. He walked the pavement for hours, his footsteps echoing in the cracks of the sidewalk. He did not look for old friends or former colleagues. He kept his head down, focused on the gray concrete, moving through the crowds like a ghost in a machine. His pockets were light, his pace was slow, and the world had stopped demanding his attention. He was no longer the man in the corner office. He was just another shadow crossing the street, searching for a sign that he might still be needed. He stood before the glass doors of the Sterling Group. The letters were etched in gold, gleaming against the morning sun. He pushed the heavy frame open and stepped into the lobby. The air here was conditioned, crisp, and smelled of expensive paper. He approached the front desk, his throat tight. The secretary did not look up immediately. She tapped her keyboard, her rhythm methodical and slow. She gestured toward a row of chairs against the far wall. Richard sat. He checked the clock on the wall. 10 o'clock. He crossed his legs, then uncrossed them. The lobby was quiet, save for the hum of the printer and the occasional muffled ring of a phone behind the partition. He watched the minute hand crawl. 11 o'clock. His stomach knotted. He smoothed the fabric of his lapel, checking for lint that was no longer there. 12 o'clock. 3 hours had passed. His pulse thrummed against his collar, a frantic, irregular beat. He had rehearsed his apology 1,000 times, but the words felt thin, insufficient. The secretary finally looked up and nodded toward the Andalard. Richard stood, his legs trembling. He took a breath, stepped forward, and placed his hand on the cold brass handle. The heavy door swung inward with a soft, pressurized hiss. Richard stepped across the threshold, his eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for the command to approach. The room was expansive, filled with the scent of polished mahogany and stale coffee. He took one step, then another, his pulse loud in his ears like a drumbeat. He raised his gaze, expecting a stranger, a corporate face, a judge of his character. Instead, the world tilted. Behind the desk, a man sat reviewing a stack of dense files. He held a pen, his movement steady, his focus absolute. Richard stopped dead, his breath hitched, turning into a sharp, jagged sound in the quiet office. He blinked, but the image remained. It was him, the man he had once dismissed with a wave of his hand in a silent restaurant, the man he had called useless, the man he had looked down upon from the height of his own arrogance. Daniel sat there, the personification of the past he had tried to bury. The silence in the room was no longer just empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and filled with the sudden, undeniable weight of a memory returning to demand payment. Richard stood paralyzed, the distance between the door and the desk suddenly feeling like a chasm he could not cross. Richard felt his knees buckle, a traitorous weakness that forced him to grip the doorframe for support. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the chaos in his mind. The memory of that restaurant, the sharp, cutting words, the callous laugh rushed back, colder and sharper than he remembered. He looked at the floor, unable to meet the steady gaze from across the desk. His hands, once used to pointing and commanding, now hung limp and tremulous at his sides. He tried to speak, but the sound caught in his throat, emerging only as a ragged, choked breath. He took a staggering step backward, his back hitting the doorframe. "I should go," he muttered, his voice barely audible, scraping against the silence of the room. "I do not deserve to be here. I do not deserve your kindness." He kept his chin pressed to his chest, shoulders slumped, waiting for the dismissal he knew he had earned months ago. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward, trapping him in the circle of his own past mistakes. He prepared to turn, to retreat back into the hallway, to vanish before the inevitable judgment could be spoken aloud. Richard pivoted to leave, his hand fumbling for the door handle. A chair scraped against the hardwood floor. The sound was sharp, sudden, and halted his retreat. He froze as footsteps approached, slow and rhythmic, closing the gap between the desk and the threshold. Daniel did not stop at the edge of the rug. He walked until he stood directly in Richard's path. Richard kept his eyes fixed on his own worn shoes, bracing for the sting of a rebuke. Instead, a hand appeared in his line of sight. It was open, palm upward, steady and still. "Mr. Wilson, please, have a seat," Daniel said. His voice was calm, devoid of the jagged edge Richard had once used against him. Daniel gestured toward the chair in front of the desk. Richard flinched, but he did not pull away. "Anger teaches us nothing," Daniel continued, his tone clinical and direct. "Kindness teaches us everything." The room seemed to expand. The pressure behind Richard's eyes peaked, a physical weight that finally gave way. He let out a long, ragged exhale that shook his entire frame. He looked up, his face tight, and saw only the invitation to stop running. Daniel turned and moved back toward the desk, pulling a single document from a folder and sliding it across the polished surface. Richard moved to the chair and sat. The wood felt solid beneath him. He took the pen Daniel offered, but his fingers betrayed him, shaking so hard the nib scratched against the paper. He stopped, braced his wrist against the desk, and took a slow, steadying breath. He pressed the ink into the signature line, forming his name with a new, deliberate pressure. He pushed the paper back across the desk and stood up. The weight that had defined his posture for months shifted. He walked to the office door, opened it, and stepped out into the building's lobby. He pushed through the glass doors and emerged onto the sidewalk. The city skyline rose above him, iron and glass catching the late afternoon sun. He watched the crowd moving past, no longer seeing them as obstacles or subordinates. He felt the pavement beneath his feet, firm and real. He stopped at the corner and looked at his reflection in a storefront window. He did not see the man from the restaurant. He saw someone who finally understood the math of the world. Money drained away, leaving only the hollow space behind, but the choice to act with grace remained. He turned and walked into the flow of the city, carrying the weight of that lesson forward.